This episode is brought to you by Brilliant, the online learning platform that allows you to learn about interesting and important topics through a fun and interactive method of teaching that enables anyone to master almost any topic from basics to advanced. Let me give you an example of this. Advanced math in calculus and linear algebra. Okay, I know nothing about this. I took algebra in middle school, and I think that was the end of that. I never got to calculus. So I'm going to take this course here, in which I just begin my path with calculus introduction, then derivatives and integrals, multivariable calculus, linear algebra, and modeling the world by mastering mathematical ideas that scientists and engineers use every day. And it starts right there with vector calculus. Okay. If I just read that, I'd think I have no chance of mastering this. But you know what? When you go through the Brilliant programs, step by step by step, and they give you little quizzes and immediate feedback, that is way better than watching lecture videos online, which I do all the time, but I never remember anything. They're just entertainment. Brilliant offers actual learning experiences. So check it out. Go to brilliant.org/skeptic to get a free 30-day trial and 20% off your annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/skeptic for a free 30-day trial and 20% off your annual premium subscription. It's a great program. Check it out. My guest today I got a really special guest today. I loved his book, A.J. Jacobs. He's a journalist, lecturer, and human guinea pig whose books include Drop Dead Healthy, The Year of Living Biblically, and The Puzzler. He's a contributor to NPR, the New York Times, and Esquire, among other media outlets. He lives in New York City with his family, and his new book, here it is. Wait, I have the image of it here. 1 second. The Year of Living Constitutionally. I don't have a physical copy, AJ, but I got the audio copy. The Year of Living Constitutionally, one man's humble quest to follow the Constitution's original meaning. I do have this. I have a little mini Constitution Declaration of Independence, so we could do some read-alongs. Nice to see you.
Great to be here. Yes.
Yeah, let's start with, what's your story? How did you get into doing this crazy stuff? I listened to your biblical book. I didn't read the one about being healthy, dying to be healthy.
Well, first of all, just to back up, I'm a fan of your writing and your thinking, and skepticism in general. So I'm honored to be here.
Oh, wow.
And yes, I guess I do what's called experiential journalism or method writing, or slightly less complimentary stunt journalism. Whatever you want to call it is fine with me. But I dive in and I immerse myself in these projects and I try to live the topic. And I guess it came about partly, I was a big fan of George Plimpton, the writer, who he joined various professional sports teams as a regular guy and wrote about that. Got punched in the face by a heavyweight boxer. I prefer social awkwardness and social pain to physical pain. So I went with more of lifestyle experiments, although I have had my fair share of physical pain.
Yeah, you're lucky you did get punched carrying around a musket in New York City and walking into a Starbucks.
I know. I mean, punched or worse, because those things take so long to load. It's not like it's going to be a very good way of defending myself.
Yeah, I loved George Plimpton. There was a movie made on one of his books, Paper Lion, where he played quarterback for the Detroit Lions and got himself banged up pretty good.
Yeah, I never saw the movie, but I read all of it. I think it
was, let's see, who played him? Was it Alan Alda, maybe? I forget now who it was. Anyway, it was great. I love that kind of gonzo journalism. It's big fun. So yeah, the biblical book, let's come back. We could come back to that later, the constitutional book. So this is sort of a sequel, I guess, but I suppose the timing is pretty good considering what's going on in our country and our democracy and how heated this upcoming election is. And oh my God, what does the Constitution say about all of these things?
Oh yeah, no, I don't know if I should say I got lucky, because I don't want these problems, but it certainly is extremely relevant right now. And that was part of the motivation. I mean, I sort of had a couple of agendas. One was with all the headlines about the Constitution and how it affected the Supreme Court's rulings, I wanted a crash course in the Constitution. So I thought one way to get a crash course, to live it, to follow it, carry my musket, write with quills. Another was to examine this, how should we interpret the Constitution? Because the Supreme Court became so originalist in the last couple of years, and which, as your listeners probably know, means they believe the original meaning from 1789 is the most important factor in deciding what the Constitution means and how we should rule now. And I also, I felt that we've got a lot of problems right now. Is there any wisdom from the 18th century way of living that maybe we should reinvestigate? And certainly there's a lot we don't want to revive. It was an incredibly sexist, racist, homophobic, smelly, dangerous, horrible time in many respects. But what about the idea of virtue and sacrificing for the greater good? What about cold takes instead of hot takes? All of these things, I thought maybe there's something there.
All right, let's start with some of the fun and funny stuff. Immersing yourself into that culture, the clothing, the quill pen, the paper, the tricorn hat, all that stuff. Where do you get all that stuff?
Oh, there's a huge market for it because there are all these reenactors who are Revolutionary War reenactors. I was more focused on the Constitution, but that's not quite as popular. People don't like to reenact signing a document. They like the guns, but you can buy all sorts of things. I bought my musket on ye old internet, of course, and I actually got one from the 18th century, which, as far as I could tell, in New York, where I live, is not illegal because it's counted as an antique. But once you load it, then it does become a weapon, and you have to register it. So I don't know. It was a bit of a gray area, and I might have violated some laws, but I haven't been arrested yet.
Yeah, I loved your reference to was it the stitchers, the people that count the number of stitches?
That's it. Stitch counters. Right. This is in the, among the community of people who reenact the Revolutionary War. Some of them are really hardcore and they want total authenticity. And so they count the number of stitches in the coat or the pants to make sure that you've got it right. And yeah, so it is a fascinating community. They call it the hobby. That's sort of how some people call New York the city. This is called the hobby reenacting.
Yeah. I remember just quite by chance in 1988, I guess it was, at the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, we took the Race Across America when I was one of the race directors right through Gettysburg. And I hadn't even thought about it. I wasn't even thinking about it. It was completely random. The route went through there. We had a time station in Gettysburg. So we pull in there to the time station where volunteers keep track of the cyclists that come through and record their time there. And all of a sudden, there's like all these people walking around in 1863 garb with their weapons and everything. I'm like, what is this? It's like, oh, it's a big reenactment. So, we were there for like 2 days. So I just kind of walked around and talked to people. And they had all the medical stuff and would have been like to saw somebody's leg off without anesthesia and all that kind of stuff. It was insane, but it was super interesting.
Oh, yeah. Well, I do think that you'll never be able to get inside the minds of someone from the 18th century, and that's probably good. As you say, I don't want to have my leg sawed off without anesthesia. But there are some insights into even just dressing up. I'm sure you've seen a lot of the studies that what you wear affects how you think. And I'll just give you one very small example is I was wearing my full-on coat and my 18th century stockings, and they didn't have elastic. So, of course, the stockings are going to fall to the ankles, so you have to put on little sock belts. They're not even garters. They're not sophisticated. So every morning I would spend 2-3 minutes putting on my sock belts, and I'll never get that time back. So I learned to appreciate many things. Democracy, first of all, but also elastic socks. I do
and
never
no zippers,
will take
right?
No zippers, right? And washing dishes. You didn't have a faucet in your kitchen, and so you would have to go out to the river or to the well. So yeah, it was not the good old days in general. And you've talked about this. I think you gave a great TED talk about this. The good old days were not good. They were horrible in many ways.
Yeah.
And we have
I forget what the
problems now.
toilets were like then.
They were they varied. I mean, they're sometimes just a pit or the outhouse. I mean, one thing, and this may be, I'll just say it I won't go into detail, but James Madison had serious gastrointestinal issues. And so he would be riding up to the Constitutional Convention and he would have to run off into the woods every few minutes. And this was one of the most powerful people in the world. And I think we underestimate how hard life was.
Yeah. Yeah, astonishing. Their writing was so incredible, though. Most of these guys were classically trained, by which I mean, Latin, and they studied ancient Greece and Rome and all the giant philosophers then. And then they themselves were inheritors of the scientific revolution and the age of reason and enlightenment. They were in the Enlightenment. They were part of the Enlightenment. So that really, reflects the style. You talk about their writing, especially their penmanship. Also, just one of these little details, getting your quill and what kind of paper was it? It was like a cotton
rag. The fanciest parchment made of animal skin, but most people. I mean, what was interesting? Yeah, first of all, the question is, was their thinking more subtle and sophisticated than the average politicians now? I would argue yes. I would also say, why is that? And there are, I think, many reasons. You mentioned the education, but I also think one was the technology. Writing with a quill really does change the way you think because you are cut off from the internet. You're cut off from the dings and pings, and you actually can concentrate and figure stuff out, ideally. And so I felt that. And I'm not saying, I'm not a Luddite. I don't think we should all go back to quills. But writing offline, either by hand or on just a laptop that's not connected, I think changes the way you think and makes you a better, more subtle thinker. And it's more conducive, as I said, to cold takes than to hot takes, and more conducive to, less conducive to just reacting with emotion and anger, which I feel the internet is enraged to engage.
Terrible.
Yeah, it's the worst. I will say, the news cycle then, Ben Franklin's newspaper came out twice a week. 16 pages, you read it twice a week. Now, I don't think we should go back to that, but it allowed you to digest the information, to think about it, come up with solutions. And so you're not, right now, if at my worst, I am angry 16 hours a day because I see these enraging headlines. And that's not a way to live. That's not a way to come up with solutions to make the world better. And to me, that's a huge problem. So maybe it is better twice a week news. Who knows? Certainly less than what we have now.
Yeah, when I was writing my monthly Scientific American column, that felt like about the right pace. I don't really want to do more than that. I can't imagine being a weekly columnist for a newspaper or something like that. It seems like pressure is on. Now I feel like my team is telling me, you got to post something every day. I'm like, every day?
Right.
Who has time for that?
Exactly. And you don't have to have an opinion on everything. I mean, everyone wants you to have an opinion on every topic, even if you haven't thought about it or read about it deeply. And so I do think, and this I think relates to one of your great passions, I think the founders had more epistemic humility than we do now. And I wrote in the book about Ben Franklin during the Constitution Convention. He said, the older I get, the less certain I am of my own opinions. And he told this lovely story. He said, there was this French lady, and she said to her sister, why is it that I'm the only person I've ever met who is correct on every single issue? And his point was, we're all the French lady. I mean, and no offense to the French. It was Ben Franklin. Write the letters to him if you're upset. But he's sort of, I feel, was a very early behavioral economist. He was looking like Daniel Kahneman and saying, we all have these biases and we all think we're correct, and we're not.
Yeah. Yeah, so you went back and reread the Constitution, which is a good thing to do because, I mean, I don't think I've ever sat down and read it all the way through, except for this morning. I kind of picked this up and started scanning again. But the writing really is incredible. Let me just read, well, here I'll just read the opening of the Declaration of Independence. By the way, this is not the Trump Bible and Constitution Declaration, okay?
Good to make sure people know.
All right, so this is the action of the Second Continental Congress, July 4th, 1776. Amazing they got the date. That's like the most famous. They happened to pick the most famous date in America. Okay.
Weird.
Anyway, okay. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. So first of all, they're like, screw you, we're leaving. It's like, no, we're going to sit down and calmly write down what we're pissed off about. And then they go, and by the way, there's several references, even though it's a secular document, religion's not allowed to influence the government, supposedly. Yet there are references to, nature's God, the laws of nature, and the creator. And, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Is that just just sort of a linguistic or literary style, or do you think they were kind of invoking a deeper, outside objective source for their claims?
Well, it's a great question. I think that the way they talked and wrote did affect the way they thought, because there were so many dependent clauses, so much indirect language. So, for instance, if you got angry at someone, you wouldn't say screw you. You would say, it behooves me to express my dissatisfaction with the behavior that you have exhibited, that kind of thing. Now, I think that just using that language acts as a coolant to your brain and makes you a little less angry. And I wonder if we couldn't do more. Now, there are downsides to that kind of indirect. I remember Malcolm Gladwell wrote a piece, no, maybe it was Freakonomics, one of those, about how a Korean air pilot, the second in charge, was so polite that he couldn't say, we're about to crash into a mountain. He said, you might want to reconsider or pulling up a little. So there are downsides to it, but I think there are also upsides. I think that we are way too addicted to rage, and that this might be a strategy to make us a little less angry.
I remember that. I think that was a Freakonomics thing, but it might have been Malcolm Gladwell. In any case, it was that culture shapes how a subordinate responds to a subordinate, the boss, and that they had to kind of retrain their pilots to be sure, and if you see something, say something, and don't hold back. Don't be too polite.
Right.
Right. Anyway, continuing, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By the way, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Is it really self-evident? I mean, historically, it wasn't at all self-evident. It's almost like they're just declaring it.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a bit of chutzpah. It's saying, we don't have to prove it because it's so obvious, but it's not. It is not obvious, and it still isn't obvious. I mean, they are also assuming that there are rights, which I'm not sure exist in a sort of a more realistic way, the same way an elephant exists. So, but I will say they also balanced rights with responsibilities. And that is one big difference between the 18th century view of the world. I do think, from the historians I talked to, you had these rights, right to free speech, but you also had a responsibility. You had to think of the common good. You had to have virtue, all of this. And that, I think, is a balance we've lost, and it's hurting our society.
Yeah, just kind of reading your book and through the Constitution again, it brings up that question is, where are the Jeffersons and Hamiltons and Madisons today? And is it that they don't go into government and politics because it's such a ugly business, and they go into academia or Hollywood or Wall Street or, something that pays much better and you're not hated as much?
That's a great question. Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, I think also, Adam Grant did a study, or he cited studies that people who go into politics have this dark triad of personality traits: Machiavellianism and
narcissism,
maybe masochism.
Yeah, no, no. Let's see. It's narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
Okay, there you go. So that's not good. But I do think that back then, the people who went in, and they had huge flaws, and among them owning slaves, obviously a massive flaw. But a lot of them also thought about the greater good and seeing it as service, real service to the country, as opposed to self-aggrandizement. And I do think George Washington, for all of his flaws, really was someone who thought about the greater good. And the fact that he gave up the presidency after 2 terms is, King George III allegedly said, if he does that, he's the greatest person to have ever lived. And he did. It's really remarkable. And I think you have some good people in politics now, but the incentives are, it's such a, you have to be so cutthroat, I feel, that you're not going to attract as many people who have this noble purpose of trying to help the others and help the country.
Yeah, I always wonder why some of these dictators don't look at history and go, I should just step down and I'll be like George Washington now that I got my country back on its feet. And then they go, nah, I don't want to give up all this power and money and all the goodies I get.
Right. Yeah, it takes someone pretty amazing to do that.
It's almost like the whole free speech thing. We'll get into that in a minute because you have a whole section on that. But, why is it that the trend in history is the moment you get into power is we really need to silence those people over there? Otherwise, I'm in favor of free speech, but that is hate speech or that's, inciting violence or whatever. We must silence it. It seems like it happens to almost everybody.
Right. It's like, yes. And I feel I think I suffer from the same short-sightedness as well. Like I often think I'm sort of a deontologist towards myself and a consequentialist towards everyone else. It's like, I have the right to do this, but other people should think of how it affects the common good.
AJ, that's a great way to put it. I'm going to steal that. I like that. Okay, continuing. Let's see. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's one sentence, by the way, which I started earlier before I interrupted it. And then the last one, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. In other words, we're serious. And the rest of it is just, here's all the stuff we don't like.
Oh, yeah. No, they had it was like a list of complaints. Like and one of the top ones was soldiers being quartered in their houses, which is why the Third Amendment to the United States Constitution is that you shall not be forced to quarter soldiers against your consent, which I always think is so interesting that this is number 3. Like, this is the top 3: freedom of speech, then you've got the right to bear arms, and then quartering soldiers.
I know you bring up, everyone talks about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. Oh, the Second Amendment people. And then the First Amendment, the free speech. What about the Third Amendment? Which one is that again?
It does not get the, but I think it's symptomatic of, this was a document written 237 years ago. They had very different concerns and very different worldview. And luckily, I think some of it carries through. Some of it is, I won't say eternal, I don't believe that, but I think relatively timeless, like the idea of freedom and equality and general welfare. Those are good things, but a lot of it is very specific to the time.
Yeah. So you start with this sentence: "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." All right. What did you like about that?
Well, that to me that's the best 52 words in the whole Constitution. I mean, it's so inspiring. And first of all, I like that they mentioned the common good, the common welfare, general welfare,
Yes.
which I think, as we talked about, people sort of have ignored a little more and focused on the rights. But yeah, that is, to me, at its most elegant and inspiring. And then there are parts I talk about. It's very much a sort of a mental whiplash reading the Constitution, because you do have this wonderful opening. Then it gets into how to set up the government, and it gets very technical. It's like a very complicated board game, like Settlers of Catan. And then you have flaws and mistakes, including the fact that the state of Pennsylvania is spelled two different ways, Penn and Pen. So anyone who says this is a sacred, flawless document can just run it through spell check like I did. And it.
Oh, that's right. You ran it through Grammarly. That was
Grammarly.
Hilarious.
Yeah,
There's like hundreds of mistakes.
Hundreds. And some of them are stylistic to the time. Yeah. But yeah, some are. There's a missing apostrophe in one of the its, which would get, if that was on Twitter, you'd get slammed. So it is not flawless. And then there are parts that are truly offensive. The parts about, they don't use the word slavery. They use euphemisms like labor and service, but they're still in there. And what I thought was fascinating is that James Madison, if he had his way, they would not be in there, because he wanted the amendments to work like a Google Doc. Like, you make an amendment and then you rewrite the whole Constitution. But he was overruled. So now we have the original, and then we have all these PS, PPS, PPPPS. And I think there are advantages to both. One scholar says it's good to see how far we've come. The fact that you have this mention of human slavery in the Constitution is a reminder we have made progress, and that we shouldn't be totally pessimistic about our chance of making more progress.
Yeah. What is your sense of how many of them thought, this is we should do something about this, but it's just not the time, and our brothers down south are not going to sign on if we don't do it?
I think many of them realized that this was an evil, but they were too hypocritical and lazy to want to give up their lifestyle. And Thomas Jefferson says as much in his writings. Jeff Rosen, the great constitutional scholar, talks about this. Jefferson knows that it's an evil, and yet he said, I am too, I forget the word he uses, but I'm too greedy to want to abolish it in my lifetime. So yeah, they knew, a lot of them. And it brings up, I have, it's interesting because I think you can view the Constitution two ways. So you can view it as a document that condones slavocracy, or you can view it as a document that's sort of sows the seeds of freedom. And I loved reading about Frederick Douglass and his, when he, before the Civil War, there was sort of a feud between him and William Lloyd Garrison, the other famous abolitionist. And William Lloyd Garrison said that this Constitution is he called it a pact with the devil because it condones slavery. And he said it should be burned. And he burned it on stage in front of hundreds of people. He was a showman. He's like, this is... And at first, Frederick Douglass disagreed with him. I mean, at first, Frederick Douglass agreed with him. But then in the 1850s, Douglas made a change and decided it's better to view the Constitution as a promissory note. It's got all this wonderful language about equality and about freedom and liberty, and America is not living up to that language. So let's make America live up to that language. And that theme has echoed throughout. Martin Luther King used that phrase, the promissory note. Obama, in his speech on race, talked about it being a promise that the solution to the Constitution's problems are in the Constitution itself, and we've got to make it live up to its best parts. So I think it's fascinating. It all depends how you frame the Constitution.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there is an argument made, though, that the Southern colonies would not have joined the Union had they not been allowed to keep their slaves, as just another kind of point in there, I think. Yeah. Okay. So what kind of government do we have? We have to talk about democracy, but there's that famous story of when Franklin comes out of the big meeting and the lady says, "What have we got?" And he says, "A republic, if you can keep it." But technically It's a constitutional republic, right?
Right. And it was interesting because in one sense, it was an incredibly democratic revolution because for the first time, a portion of the country could vote for who governed them. But on the other hand, they were very afraid of the mobs, as they called them, the hoi polloi, and they were elitists. So they built in these counter-majoritarian measures like the Electoral College. And one of the famous toasts of the time was freedom from mobs as well as kings. Freedom from mobs as well as kings. So they did not trust either extreme. And they thought that there would be this educated elite who would sort of moderate the passions of the common people. So yes, that is, and I think you've seen over the centuries, we have expanded what we the people means. So it's not just the white male elites. It has been expanded to women and black people and indigenous people. So in one sense, some of the founders might object to that. But on the other hand, I think they were progressive in their time. So maybe they would see that this is the way that we've got to expand that that circle of morality to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was Madison that called it the tyranny of the majority. You get that 51% that says, this is what we want, this week, and we're making the rest of you go along with it. And their idea here is like, well, hang on, let's not change things willy-nilly. How did they put it here? That was such a great phrase. For light and transient causes.
Right.
Yeah, if we're going to make big changes, we got to have a lot of hurdles in there to make sure you've really thought this through. So any of these amendments to the Constitution, I forget what the rules, 2/3 states have to sign off on it, right?
Right.
That's the lot.
Well, exactly. And I will say, the famous argument against the tyranny of the majority, there's the old joke, it's the, oh, shoot, sorry.
It's all right.
That you have 2 lions and a lamb voting on what should be for dinner. So what's going to happen. So that's sort of that's one that more some conservatives use to say we should not have a democracy. We should have a republic. But I do think that the founders would be shocked by many things about today's government. And one of them, I think, would be that how hard it is to change the Constitution. They wanted it to be hard, but not this hard. I mean, they didn't see this the rigid two-party system coming. And you need 2/3, as you say, of Congress to agree. It is so incredibly hard to change the Constitution. And I talked to the last guy who changed it, this guy who passed the 27th Amendment, which is a fine amendment, but it's nothing world-shattering. It's that Congress can't give itself a raise immediately. It has to wait till the next one. I don't even think that one would pass today. So I think, we need to amend the way the Constitution is amended, but it's a catch-22 because we can't amend that without amending the Constitution.
Yeah. I was just going to read a portion of the from the Moral Arc on the 19th Amendment and how it finally got ratified. I mean, it's astonishing if you think about it. It wasn't until 1920. I mean, we were not a democracy, at least until 1920. Half the adult population could not vote.
Right.
Just, what?
It's crazy.
At long last, in 1920, the 19th Amendment, originally drafted by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1878, was passed by a single vote, thanks to 24-year-old Harry T. Byrne, a Tennessee legislator who had originally intended to vote against his state ratifying the amendment, which needed ratification of 36 of the then 48 states to pass, but changed his mind because of a note from his mother. Dear son, hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I've been watching to see how you stood, but I have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. Your mother.
I love it. And first of all, she uses cat and ratification. It's like a mom joke, I guess. But yes, that was Feb Byrne, an unsung hero of America. I mean, it is funny because I do think most progress comes from the cooperation of thousands, millions of people. But sometimes one person really can make a huge difference. And this woman...
Have you ever seen this woman, Inez Milholland, on her horse, white dress on a horse, marching on Washington, D.C.? It's just
interesting.
It's great.
Yeah.
So then I wrote, in the end, then suffrage for women came down to the vote of one young man influenced by his mom. It was rumored that the anti-suffragists were so angry at his decision that they chased him from the chamber, forced him to climb out a window of the Capitol an inch along a ledge to safety. I mean, come on, really?
Well, yeah, thank God he listened to his mom. I mean, it is, so that was fascinating.
So, so that took a long time. Civil rights took decades. The same-sex marriage and gay rights thing, that happened remarkably fast. It seems like we're picking up steam for moral revolutions like that. In 2011, Obama and Hillary were both at least publicly against same-sex marriage. And by 2015, 4 years later, the Supreme Court says this is the law of the land. Wow.
It was amazing. And I remember, I think Cass Sunstein wrote about why it happened so quickly. I think part of it might have been that most people agreed with it privately, but no one was saying it publicly. So it was sort of a problem of communication. But it was, it was remarkable.
Yeah, there you have a problem of common knowledge where, and sometimes called pluralistic ignorance, where everybody thinks everybody else thinks a certain way, when in fact most of them don't. And without communication, and then the moment you find out, well, everybody else is thinking what I'm thinking, well, let's just go for it. And then all of a sudden the thing turns pretty fast like that. But you have to have a free press and lots of open communication and no cancel culture so that people don't self-censor like that. Yeah. Okay, so the rest of most of the Constitution is just kind of grinding through the rules. So like if the president dies and the vice president, then who's the third person in line? I forget it. Speaker of the House, I think it is the third person in line.
I think so, anyway. Right.
I mean, there's all that stuff that they just have to have. So the point of the first 10 amendments is to counter this tyranny of the majority problem, that you're going to have free speech no matter what the majority thinks. It's right there. And you can't change that. Okay, but what did they mean by free speech? Let's just go through some of the hot button topics. What did they mean by free speech compared to how we think of it today?
Well, that was what was fascinating. I am, as most journalists are, a fan of free speech, but I'm a fan of the 20th century version of free speech, which is very expansive. The founders had a much more restricted idea of free speech, which was totally surprising to me. But there's great work by Judd Campbell from Stanford on this. And they believed their natural rights theory. They believed that you're born with natural rights, but once you contract with society, those rights are limited by the greater good. So you do have freedom of press meant you don't have to go to the king and say, can I print this book? You can print it. But once it's out there, the government does have the right to punish you if they think it is something that will compromise the common good or cause our fragile infant democracy to fail. So I couldn't believe the laws that were considered constitutional back then. There were many states had blasphemy laws. So New York had a law, and I tried to institute it in my house, 37.5 cents every time you cursed or blasphemed. And I have teenage sons, so I'm like, trying
Ka-ching.
to, yeah, I'm like, they wouldn't pay it because, they're kids. So they were like, oh, what about the half cent? I'm not going to pay the half. So they found a loophole. However, it was there. And then Thomas Jefferson was a little more pro free speech than others, but even he was less than what we have now. And John Adams was no fan of free speech. He had the Alien and Sedition Acts, where if you made one poor soul made an ass joke about John Adams, or an arse joke to be technical. He said he was at some festivities and they were shooting off cannons for John Adams, and he said, I wish one of the cannonballs would pass through John Adams' arse. And someone overheard him, reported it to the police, and he was thrown in jail. So it is really remarkable how far we've come with free speech. And I know that there are threats from both sides, the left and the right, and I think those are real threats to free speech. But let's not go back to the original free speech, because it wasn't quite Stalinist Russia, but it was tough. We shouldn't glorify the original free speech. We should glorify
there's an argument for your discussion on originalism versus the living Constitution.
Exactly, right.
I mean, most people that argue for originalism, they don't know what it actually said or what the precedence was at the time. So in this case, this has changed. Why? Because of Supreme Court decisions like, is it okay to burn the American flag? No, that would be unconstitutional. Well, actually, that was pretty late, right? 1960s or something like that. And
right.
The Jehovah's Witness case, where they were being forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and they had to sue to just get their kids not have to say the Pledge of Allegiance. There's just dozens of cases like that have expanded the meaning of these original words.
Well, yeah, that was fascinating reading the history of the First Amendment, and I was really surprised by the role that Jehovah's Witnesses played, because it wasn't just that one suit. It was literally over, I think, 24 suits in the 40s and 50s that expanded free speech. And of course, I disagree with what they were saying. And reading the transcripts of the trials are hilarious, because they're very religious lawyers hectoring the justices and condemning them to hell. But I think they were on the side of right in terms of free speech.
Yeah, so but also expression is now included as speech, right? If Madonna wants to do her music video that's very sexualized with a cross or whatever, that's a kind of speech because it's expressing, even though she's not saying something.
Yeah. Well, and again, back in the very early America, at least at the state level, because remember, the First Amendment only applied to the federal government at the time, and the states were not covered by any of the first 10 amendments. But but states, like I read Connecticut's state law from the late 1700s, you couldn't juggle. Juggling was considered bad. Magic, acrobatics, all sorts of this free expression that was just really, they were worried, corrosive to the moral fiber of the society. So
wow.
Thank God.
So this is sort of like the broken windows theory of crime. If we allow this little thing here, we allow some prostitution down the street, then we're going to get this and that. Before you know it, the whole thing falls apart. So we have to stop it right there. That's the
exactly.
argument.
I mean, that's what these scholars tell me, is that they weren't even that concerned about the blasphemy part. They didn't. It wasn't that it was an offense against God. It was an offense against the civil order. That they were worried, like you said, if people start disrespecting God, then where does it stop? And that's why atheists actually were considered a real threat, because they couldn't swear on the Bible in court. So how can you trust them to follow the law? They are, this was. So there are all these crazy quotes from back then where, they say, murderers, thieves, and atheists. Like atheists is put in the same category as the worst, most violent crimes.
Thanks.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, freedom of press. So how is it different then than now? I'm just thinking of the Sullivan case where Nixon tried to shut down the New York Times publication of the Pentagon Papers and so on. What kind of restrictions did they have back then?
Well, it depended on the founding father. I mean, Jefferson was a little more liberal in his freedom of the press, but even he would figure out ways. He would write and say to state legislatures or state governors, you should. Our federal government can't do anything because that's the first one, but you should shut these people down who are trying to criticize me. So even he, as we just talked about, not always, he had some hypocrisy. But others were very happy to shut down the presses, like John Adams. He was just not a fan of freedom of the press. I guess he thought, like they did, like you don't need to get permission to print something, but once you do, I'm going to come after you.
Right. About freedom to assemble and protest.
Well, that was interesting. It also depended on the founding father. I interviewed a scholar, Saul Cornell, and he said if you were a Jeffersonian, you would be okay with raucous freedom of assembly, meaning something like a march, like a demonstration. That was fine. At the Whiskey Rebellion, some of them were rooting them on. But if you were on the other side, the Adams Federalist side, then you thought this was not freedom of assembly. Freedom of assembly meant gathering at the coffee house or tavern in a civil way and having a discussion and maybe writing a letter to the editor and then going back home and obeying the law. That was freedom of assembly. So yeah, it definitely depended on where you were.
And then religion. So at the time, a lot of the colonies had an official state, or I guess colony and then state religion.
I couldn't believe it. I was shocked because, as I mentioned, the Bill of Rights was only considered to apply to the federal government. So when it says that you should have no established religion, that meant the United States government cannot say this is a Christian country. The states were not covered by it. So several of the states had established religions, like Connecticut was Congregationalist. I think Massachusetts was also Congregationalist, several of them. And what that meant was that some of your tax dollars went directly to the church. It meant things like if you were not a part of that, if you were not Protestant, you could not serve on a jury, for instance. It was just astounding to me. And luckily, this was phased out. And especially after the 14th Amendment, the justices decided that applied. That meant those rights apply to everyone, not just the nation, but also to states and to individuals. But yeah, it was weird to me because it is a complicated one whether how secular it was back then. I don't think it's an easy answer. I wanted it to be. Before I started researching, I was on the side that separation of church and state. That's what the founders wanted, and that's what we should have. I don't think it was that simple. I think some of the founders were okay with religion mixing with the state, which is another reason why we don't want to go originalist. So we shouldn't just say, well, that's the way the founding fathers wanted it, therefore let's do it. Let's look at the current situation and see how this affects us. But yes, some of the founders were alarmingly okay with religion and government mixing.
I think one of the arguments was that if you're going to have a self-governing people over an extended territory that we can't regulate and control with police, they need to be self-governing. They got to have a little, eye in the sky in their head thinking, I better be good,
Yeah.
just in case. No one sees me, but the eye in the sky may see me. So
Right.
I think they saw it as an internal way of controlling people.
That's interesting. And they did talk a lot about virtue and this idea, which they saw as sort of putting putting the common good, putting the community on par or ahead of your own interests. And a lot of them thought people need virtue. This republic or democracy will not survive if people are not virtuous. But they were very worried because they weren't sure that people were virtuous enough. So a lot of them were pessimistic at the end of their lives.
Yeah, because if it's taught in the home, government can't control what goes on in the home.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess, partly why they had these things like the militia. Everyone who was an adult male, white adult male, had to join the militia. And I guess part of the idea was you meet every 3 months and you are it reminded of your civic duty. So that way it sort of instills some glue into the country, so we know what we are.
Like in Israel, everybody serves.
Exactly.
And I'm told it's actually a good disciplinary thing. Like young men with sports, they learn discipline and rules and camaraderie and brotherhood and all this kind of stuff. And the military does something like that. And it's possible, people, we need something like that. It doesn't have to be the military, but some kind of control like that, or self-discipline.
Yeah. No, I think, yes, I don't want my kids to go into the militia or the army, but if they all had to do a month of martial arts, karate, or if they all had to join AmeriCorps for a month, maybe that would provide a glue that would make the country stronger. It's an interesting point.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk Second Amendment. The Second Amendment people want to hear this part, as they're often referred to. It's really a funny thing. If this doesn't happen for Trump, the Second Amendment people are coming. Oh, what does that mean? I think I know what that means. It sounds kind of threatening. All right, so I did a series of debates with John Lott. He's the author of More Guns, Less Crime. Just arm everybody to the teeth, and that'll solve the problem. Let God sort it out later, right? Anyway, so one of the things I put up with, the Second Amendment words, and then I put a picture of a musket saying, yeah, you can have all the muskets you want. It takes you talk about that. It takes 15 different steps to load the thing and fire it. Yeah, okay, fine. But that's very different from an automatic weapon or semi-automatic weapon today.
Totally. I mean, that was one of the main points of the book is, should the Second Amendment or other amendments apply to technology that's so vastly different? So as you point out, I got my musket on the internet, and it is hard. It takes 15 steps. You got to take out the ramrod, pour the gunpowder in, put the ramrod back. So it would be hard to do a mass shooting with a musket. So I'll just provide the two sides, because I did try to steel man both sides. So the one side, the progressive side, would say that the Second Amendment was written when the word arms meant something so vastly different that we need regulations for this new. The fact that both an AR-15 and a musket are referred to as gun is almost a coincidence, a semantic coincidence. It would be as if you had a law written in 1800 that said wheeled vehicles are allowed on this tiny little country lane. And wheeled vehicles meant bicycles or carts. And now you have 18-wheel trucks. And so do we need to change the laws? And the progressives would say yes. On the other hand, the gun rights people say, no, that is like saying the First Amendment should only apply to Ben Franklin-style wooden printing presses. But it doesn't. The First Amendment applies to the internet. It applies to everything that is speech. So it doesn't matter what the technology is. It's the principle that we have a right to bear arms. And then there's the debate, is it about individual self-defense, or is it about the sort of civic duty of being in a militia. So that's another huge
But
point of
also,
difference.
isn't the argument protecting against a tyrannous government? Should things go awry, I can protect my family, or my militia can protect our town from the federal government coming in here.
Exactly. So there is, that is a, and again, you have a debate. So you have the gun rights people say, tell the people in in Ukraine that they shouldn't have collected guns. They need them. On the other hand, you have the comedian Neil Brennan, who is a brilliant comedian who is a bit, and he says it's like, imagine if there was a game show where people, hundreds, thousands of people with their rifles try to attack the military, and the military presses one button and a drone wipes them all out, and that's the end of it. So it's like a 2-second war. So that argument no longer holds water. I think I can tell you that I think the originalist argument, looking at saying, oh, this is what the founders, they wanted us to have guns, that to me does not hold a lot of sway. Because it was such a different time. I think that more consequentialist argument about whether guns make for a safer society, I think that, if it were true, would convince me that guns should be more prevalent. But as far as I can tell, and you obviously know better, the empirical data doesn't support that, and that more guns does not make for a safer society. But you would know better.
Well, that's the conclusion I came to, although I'm not an expert on it's a vast literature. When I got into it, I just couldn't believe how much has been published on it. Part of the problem is that each side can pick their top dozen studies that show what they want to find. The more guns lead to less crime. Yeah, except that's only in that town over there, or this county, or only in that state, which has these other characteristics that you didn't control for. And, these guys, they go back and forth on these debates, but more or less, the problem is, it seems to me, is, you have 350 million Americans, you have 400 million plus guns. It's just, there's just no way we're ever going to collect them all up like they did in Australia, which, there weren't that many. And you just have, even if, the law of large numbers, even if it's just, 0.01% whack jobs that are mentally ill or angry or whatever, it's not hard to get a gun. You're going to get mass public shootings pretty much every week. And that's what we have now. And I don't know what the solution is. I really don't. I've given up.
Well, I did think, I've listened to Sam Harris talk about this issue, and he says his view alienates both sides. But he is a gun owner, and he is pro-gun in a way. But he says that he would be in favor of such rigorous checks and such rigorous training that, the gun rights advocates would be appalled. But also, since he thinks that in some cases, a homeowner who is threatened would be safer with a gun if they were well trained.
Yes.
So
yes,
I thought that was an interesting
There's
take.
studies on that, though, but because if you have a gun in the home, there's just way more things that can go wrong. Even if you're prepared or whatever, your kid gets it, or the kid's friends that are over and you're gone, or whatever, they find it, or the thief grabs it the burglar grabs it out of your hand before you can do something. Unless you're trained to practice shooting, including shooting a person, you hesitate and it's over. I don't know. It just seems like, if I lived in an inner city somewhere, maybe I'd have a gun. I'm not against guns. I grew up with guns. My stepfather was a hunter, so I had a BB gun, then a pellet gun, then a 20 gauge shotgun, then a 12 gauge shotgun, and then I had a handgun. So I've done all that. That's fine. It's all right, but I don't now. I don't know. I live in a pretty safe neighborhood in Santa Barbara, so I guess I just don't worry about it. If I lived somewhere else, maybe I would. So I get the arguments on both sides. I don't know. It's a tough one. The other argument I make is the bit about I'm worried about the government turning tyrannous and coming to get me. If they send the Navy SEALs to your house, what do you really think you're going to do? Come on.
Right. That's Neil Brennan's point.
Your example of the drone. Yeah. You don't even see it. It's 20,000 feet up.
Exactly. Well, one thing that I thought was fascinating is because I bought these 2 muskets, and I would carry them around New York, as is my Second Amendment right. And the weird thing was the psychological effect it had on me, because I felt a swagger holding
You
this
did?
gun,
Oh,
which
that's
is
great.
which is bizarre because A, it wasn't loaded, and B, even if it were, it would take me 5 minutes to put it in and shoot. So by that time, I would have been, tackled. And so there was no rational reason why I would feel more powerful. And yet something cultural or even innate made me think, oh, well, okay, now I feel safe. I've got this gun.
One of the debates I did with a lot was in Texas, like deep in the heart of Texas, so to speak.
How did that go for you?
Well, just for fun, the various debates is, how many of you are packing heat tonight? And this place in Texas, it was like almost every hand went up. I went, oh, okay. Oh, dear.
Watch what you say. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, wow. Okay. Well, so, yeah. So, okay. So let's go through some of the, all right. What does the Constitution say about abortion? To pick another hot topic.
It does not say anything.
I
It does
know.
not say anything. There is no mention. And what's interesting is you do have these debates about the history of what were the abortion laws back then, and you again get different historians with different agendas. To me, the most common historical take that I've found is that the procedure was allowed until quickening, when you felt some sort of kick. But to me, those are interesting historical facts, but that should have zero impact on current abortion law. Because again, the idea is, originalism, there are two issues. One, are we getting the mindset of the founders correct? And two, how much should that original mindset affect current policy? And in abortion, I think very little, because, this was a time when cutting edge medicine was the tobacco smoke enema, where they would literally blow smoke up your ass. That was considered, if you had a stomach ailment or even a mental ailment, like put the hose in and get the bellows out and blow. And so that we would be looking to that era for anything related to health or medicine, I think is very misguided.
Yeah. I was trying to, but here this brings up this issue of, if it's not enumerated or spelled out in the Constitution, then the federal government can't make anybody do anything, and then it reverts to the states. So it's a states' constitution issue then. And would that be an argument for abortion should be a states' rights issue, which it is now?
Right, that would be the states' rights folks. But on the other hand, there's the Ninth Amendment. The states' rights was the 10th Amendment. The Ninth Amendment says that just because a right is not enumerated, just because it's not written in the Constitution, does not mean it doesn't exist. They can't cover every right. And there are all these hidden rights, all these, and that's what the liberals in the 60s talked about, the penumbra of privacy, and that is, so that was implied. The argument is that privacy and sexual rights are implied in the Constitution, and therefore it is a constitutional and national right and should not be sent to the states.
That's really interesting. Here's the exact wording: the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That kind of opens the door for people to say, well, I think this should be a right. And even though it's not in the Constitution, it says right there.
Exactly. It's my right to, I don't know, like shoot off missiles in my... But I will say that was another fascinating historical fact I didn't know. But originally, Madison and many of the other founders did not want a Bill of Rights because of this very issue. They thought, if we spell out, here are your 25 rights, then people are going to say, all right, that's it. Those are the only rights. So that's why they were originally opposed. And when they finally said, okay, let's do it, they put in that Ninth Amendment. And conservatives, like famously Robert Bork, who was up for the Supreme Court, one of the originalists, he hated the Ninth Amendment. He called it an ink blot without meaning. So they say, yeah, this is a terrible thing just because of what you said, that anyone can say, oh, well, it's implied. It's in there somewhere, but we just can't see it. So I can do what I want.
Yeah. How did they think about rights? I mean, you have positive rights, like I have the right to speech and whatever religious practice I want and so on. Then there's negative rights, what I can't do. And then I think it was Jeremy Bentham that called rights, nonsense on stilts. Like, where are these rights? I've looked everywhere. I can't find them anywhere. You're just making this up. Without a government and an army and a military, you don't have rights.
Right. Yeah. And I tend to agree. I think they're a very useful fiction. I don't think they exist in any sort of reality. But if you talk to historians, most of them will say that natural rights theory at the time said you were born with all of these rights, but once you enter into society and are in that social contract, your rights are constrained by what's proper for the society. So they had I think our view of rights is much more, this is a trump card, no pun intended. These rights I have absolute rights. Their idea was a much more mediated rights, like we talked about, the free speech. And actually, Jamal Green, a great law professor, wrote a book called Where Rights Went Wrong, or How Rights Went Wrong. And his argument is we need this more constrained view of rights, and that other countries have a much more constrained view of rights, that we don't have these very few absolute rights. We have many rights, but they are not absolute, and they're all sort of butting against each other, and we have to figure out the best solution.
Well, like that speech by Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, of his, I forget what it was called, his Bill of Rights. Everyone should have a job and a home and 3 square meals a day, and so on. And it's like, well, where does it say that?
Well, a lot of foreign constitutions do have these positive rights of shelter, and again, like everything, that's got its drawback, its positives and negatives, because one problem is, like, how do you decide when, okay, now the environment is being respected, therefore we are in agreement with the Constitution. It's very subjective. So that's one argument against these positive rights.
Like our future children have the right to a clean environment.
Right. What does
the
that
unborn,
mean?
they're not even born yet.
Well, I am actually a fan of giving our descendants more rights, because I think, hopefully they will vastly outnumber us. But that's up for grabs.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting. I tend to agree with that. I think that makes sense. But this whole issue, gets to your discussion of originalism versus the living Constitution. I didn't realize that this was a fairly recent phenomenon. I guess starting with Roosevelt and then into the 1950s and Earl Warren. By the way, I'm less than a mile from the Earl Warren Fairgrounds here in Santa Barbara.
Yeah. Did he live there? Did he grow up there?
He was in California when he got tapped to be part of the member of the Supreme Court by Eisenhower, right? And he was conservative at the time, and then he switched.
Right.
Yeah. So it was that kind of trend that by the 70s and 80s, the pushback against the living Constitution idea, in which it was argued that they were corrupting the original meaning and using kind of politics, using the Constitution to bend politics in the way they wanted it to go.
Exactly. And I totally get that. I can understand how it came about, because the 60s, the Supreme Court made all these landmark decisions, which I happen to agree with, but they were decisions about, Brown v. Board of Education. They were decisions about victims' rights, like with Miranda, abortion, conception, intermarriage. So all of these were made by the Supreme Court. And the conservatives said, hold on, this is out of control. these 9 unelected people are making these massive decisions that are not, the country's not ready for. And maybe the country doesn't all support that. So let's go back to the text and constrain the judges so that they do not have the power to make these decisions. Now, I happen to agree with that critique that the Supreme Court is way too powerful. And I think the founders would have been appalled at how powerful the Supreme Court is. They did not buy into this. So originally, originalism, no pun intended, it was meant to constrain judges. But the weird part is now people argue originalism has gone the other way. And the originalists are like Alito making decisions on abortion that affect millions of lives. This is not constrained. This is the opposite of constrained.
Right. And isn't there a minority argument for reversing same-sex marriage rights?
Right. Exactly. Clarence Thomas has sort of hinted that he does not like the Obergefell gay marriage. And because he says, if you are a true originalist, you believe in the original meaning when that phrase was ratified. So the 14th Amendment in the 1860s talks about due process and equal protection. Back then, were they talking about equal protection for gay people? No, that was not in their mind. They were talking about mostly black men, protecting them from the racist Southern regime. So in Clarence Thomas's mind, the 14th Amendment does not cover gay marriage. And so the Obergefell, he thinks, or has hinted that it should be rolled back.
Yeah, let me read the 13th, because there's that film, and based on a book, I think, called The 13th, about the problem of the overwhelming or the overrepresentation in prison of African Americans. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So civil rights activists are claiming that clause has been used against African Americans. If you commit a crime, then this whole slavery thing and servitude, you're no longer protected from that.
Right. And yeah.
That's a weird clause. Why did they put that in there?
It is a weird clause. And a lot of people want that amended out. But as I've said, it's so hard to make an amendment. And I don't know the history well enough, but I have read the argument that, they basically were trying to replace the slavery system, but disguise it as using the jail system and prison system to replace the slavery system. And I don't know enough about the history to know how accurate that is.
It's funny how in some of these they lump a bunch of stuff in there at the same time, like the Fifth Amendment. Everybody thinks of it, I'm going to take the Fifth, so you can't, no self-incrimination. But then there's also the takings clause that's in there where the government can't just take your land without due compensation. It's like, why are those together? That's just so weird.
Right. Well, also the First Amendment. The First Amendment is so overstuffed with, I think, 5 or 6 rights. It's got the right to free speech, the right to no establishment of a religion, no freedom to exercise religion, freedom of the press, and right to petition. And I might be missing a couple. But that is, originally Madison wanted them as all separate amendments, and he was overruled. So again, in this case, I'm on Madison's side. Like, he wanted more of the bullet point. Like, he would be very good at PowerPoint. And these other guys were just like, mash them together.
Well, I think the 14th was something like that too. Yeah, it's pretty long.
Oh yeah, that one contains multitudes. Sure,
a bunch of stuff in there. Yeah, and then I love the bit about the 19th or the 18th Amendment prohibition against alcohol, and then is it the 21st that overturns it?
Oh yeah.
That we made a mistake. Repeal. Yeah, the repeal of it. Yeah, so it can happen. So it's just astonishing. These guys were unbelievably brilliant and talented, but they're not gods. This reading your section on the Supreme Court, Yeah, these 9 guys, they have a pope job. They're there for life.
Yeah.
I mean, the pope, he has direct contact with God. What? I mean, we don't think of Supreme Court justices are not talking to God. Why do they have that power?
I mean, what is amazing is how much less powerful the Supreme Court was at the founding of our country. I mean, it was not a prestigious job. I mean, it was fine, but people would turn it down because they did not have this vast power. They had, the founders, most of them believed that what is unconstitutional versus constitutional, who makes that decision? Most of the founders believed it should be a joint decision between the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court, and sort of duke it out. So the Supreme Court had judicial review, but not judicial supremacy. And what we have now is judicial supremacy, where they are the final say and they are the ultimate arbiter. And that, to me, is crazy because, as you point out, yeah, they're unelected, they're there for life. I don't understand the internet, and I'm in my 50s. To have people in their 80s trying to make consequential decisions about this massive technology is just bizarre and wrong. And they wouldn't be alive if it were the founding. You know, they didn't think that they would all live to their 80s. They would come, they would do their 5 years, and then they would die.
Right. And that building, I had no idea that building was, not 200 years old. It just looks so stately. But that there was debate about, how grand the building should be.
Oh, yeah. That was so interesting to read the history, because in the first Supreme Court was like in a market in New York, and they had to clear the butchers out because they were making too much noise. Then it moved to the Capitol, and it was in the different rooms in the Capitol. But William Howard Taft, after he stopped being president, he became a justice and the Chief Justice, and he made it his crusade to make the Supreme Court on par with the president and Congress. I guess he sort of missed the power. So he was the one who started the Supreme Court being built in this ridiculously pompous, over-the-top Roman temple. Looks like we should be sacrificing oxen. And I'll tell you, this was a telling detail. Some of the marble for the Supreme Court, the building was built in the 30s, was supplied by Benito Mussolini, who was not a fan, was quite a fan of pomp and circumstance. So, yeah, I am, as you can tell, I'm quite skeptical of the Supreme Court's power and their building. I think.
What would it take to change it so where you'd have term limits or more judges, or somehow restrain their power? Would they have to vote on it?
well, I would love to see that. One way would be an amendment to the Constitution, but that's hard. But other politicians have this sneaky idea that I like, because it says that you are in the judiciary for life. If you're appointed, you're in there as a Supreme Court. You're in there for life. But it doesn't say you have to be serving actively on the Supreme Court for life. So some people think they should sort of be put in a bullpen, like put out to pasture. They're still technically on the Supreme Court. Others say they can be demoted to a lower court so that they're still in the judiciary but not in the Supreme Court. I don't know how those would go. I mean, the problem is, I guess, who would rule on whether that's constitutional? The Supreme Court. So maybe they're not going to want to do that.
Like asking Congress to vote on term limits or more restrictions or their pay.
Exactly.
Let's see, how are they going to vote?
There's some incentive problems there.
Well, then, I mean, politically, Bill Maher was riffing on this with the RPG effect, that Ginsburg just decided, I'm going to go all the way to the end if I can. And then she dies, and now we have another conservative on the court.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I have such mixed feelings about her because I do think she was truly brilliant. I was reading about how she got women's rights and by suing on behalf of men. That is so next level, brilliant. But then she did this very, very bad thing where she refused to retire, and we are living with the consequences. So overall, I'm pro RBG, but that was a bad move.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at some of the other issues here you touched on as we kind of wrap it up here. The kind of states' rights versus federal government. I did at some point on audible.com, or maybe somewhere else, you can get the Federalist Papers and listen to all of them. And it's astonishing how just erudite these things are, and
amazing,
how carefully thought out every issue, like this side and that side and this side and that side. And also that 18th century style of writing, paragraph long sentences, therefore, furthermore, and moreover, and 10 more commas.
Right. Well, I love the intro that Hamilton wrote to the Federalist Papers, and I can't remember the exact quote, so I'm going to butcher it, but the paraphrase is that no one in politics or religion has ever been converted by force, by torture, by fire, so he was saying, let's rationally talk about these issues, and let's make a nice logical decision, which appeals to me. I love that. I don't know if it's true, but that to me is what an ideal society would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, we're still facing some of this. To what extent should the federal government intervene? Let's just say immigration. Texas says this is what we're gonna do with our border, and the federal government says, no, you're not. It's like, what?
Yeah.
Okay, who's in charge of that?
Right. Well, it is. I mean, I love changing my mind, and I do think one of the ways I evolved my thinking was about states versus the federal government. Because going into this, I agreed with Alexander Hamilton, who said during the convention, why are we keeping the states? This is crazy. You can't serve two masters. It's just confusing. Just get rid of the states. Get rid of them. He later said he was just joking because he got a lot of pushback. But I have always seen the states mostly as a hindrance. They try to push down civil rights legislation. But reading the other side, I can see the argument that Louis Brandeis made that they can be the laboratories of democracy. Like you can start on a small scale with an interesting program, whether it's Obamacare or whatever, and then if it works, then expanding it. So I now see that states have an interesting role to play. The problem now is the states are basically puppets of the two big parties. So it's not like there's this grassroots movement coming up with interesting ideas. It's that at the very top down, whether it's the Koch brothers or liberal donors who have a countrywide agenda, and they're sort of making the states follow that. So that is not the way I think the states would work ideally.
What do you think the founders would have thought about our two-party system? I mean, it's not technically two-party. There's the Green Party and the Libertarian Party and whatever RFKJ really is going to be if he can get on all 50 states ballots and so on. But really, there's just two. I mean, it's a two-team sport.
No, I think they would have been appalled. I mean, it depended on the founding father. George Washington hated the whole idea of factions because he was all about the virtue and, what's good for the country. We should get together, put our factions to the side. James Madison, on the other hand, he knew there would be factions. That's what he called parties. But he said, it's such a big country, there will be so many factions. So he sort of envisioned a much more European Parliament idea where there are 8, maybe 10 different factions, and you have different alliances and temporary alliances, and that way you get things done. So he was really opposed to this rigid even though he contributed to it, and it started very early. He was opposed to this rigid two-party system, and I think it's one of the main problems with our government today. Like having just two axes, having just two parties to choose from. And I'm not the first to make this point, but but it makes such strange bedfellows. Like, why should your view on abortion and guns and the environment all be the same? Those are three very different issues. You shouldn't be forced to choose to have a position on those just because you're part of one party.
Oh, yeah. Political scientists, if they know your position on one of those, they can predict with great certainty what your position is going to be on a bunch of other issues without ever even meeting you.
Which is crazy.
That's crazy.
Which makes sense. And sometimes it's almost the opposite, because, you could argue that if you are pro Second Amendment, you're sort of leaning libertarian, so you should be in favor of women doing whatever they want with their bodies and not having the government interfere. So in some cases, you could argue that they don't even belong together.
Right. Yeah. Well, Germany, where my wife's from, they have 5 really viable parties. So no one gets a majority. Everybody has to make coalitions, and stuff does get done. They say, well, nothing will get done. Yeah, sure it does. You just have to make compromises, which is what politics is all about. By the way, they do not have separation of church and state. When my wife was born, she was baptized Catholic. Mm-hmm. And the moment she got a job, they started withholding income from her, income taxes from her paycheck for the Catholic Church.
Oh,
so it's an opt-out program. You can opt out, but you have to go down to the courthouse, fill out the forms, and say, I no longer want to pay taxes to the Catholic Church. She actually did this.
Wow.
Just I guess that'd be 11 years ago now. And so I actually have a picture of her holding up the document. I did it. I'm free. It's crazy. But it's pretty, what we're doing in America. Yeah. It's a good promissory note for sure. That was all those pretty unusual. Late 18th century. That's really the first rights revolutions. And it didn't go so well in France, and now we have, 100 and something democracies. But yeah, it's a long struggle.
It is. And I will say, though, I am optimistic that we can keep democracy. We need reforms, and they're hard, like gerrymandering or ranked choice voting.
Right.
But I will say, I try to be optimistic and uplifting in the book, because I do believe that nihilism and giving up is not going to get us anywhere. So one little slice of positivity I had was back in the 18th century, for those who could vote, Election Day was an amazing festival.
Oh, I love that. Right. A lot of alcohol.
A lot of, they loved their rum punch. They had music, they had parades, and they had election cake. So as part of my year of living constitutionally in the book, I got, I went on Facebook, which I know is not 18th century, but it is one of the older platforms. And I went and I got hundreds of people from all over the country, every state in the union, to bake election cakes and bring them to the polls to celebrate democracy as far as we have it, and remind people, our catchphrase was democracy is sweet, so we've got to keep it. And it was just a joyous experience, kind of really weirdly emotional for me, because it's such a flood of negativity in politics. And people were so happy to have an excuse to bake cakes and celebrate democracy. And I didn't make them do, the original recipe has like cloves and figs and not everyone's taste. So I said, just do what you want. And the creativity was awesome, because it was like peaches in Georgia and cherries in Michigan. So I am doing it again this year. If anyone wants to join my election cake project, please just, my website.
Are you going to vote out loud again? What was that? Voce?
Yes.
Viva Would you walk into the polling thing and say, I vote for Kathy Ogle? No, stop. Don't tell me.
They were shocked. But yeah, that was shocking to me that it was even a thing, that most people in the 18th century voted out loud. You would just say it out. The secret ballot came much later. Australia. It's a nice import from Australia. And by the way, Australia also has the democracy sausage, which is a huge barbecue on Election Day. So I think they're onto something.
You imagine walking into a polling agency this November and say, I'd like to vote for Trump, please, or I'd like to vote for Biden. Oh my God, people would just fall apart. It'd be riot. Okay, so secession, the southern states did that famously, and they had their own constitution and money and so forth. And there's reenactors who do that too, by the way. They play the southern soldiers.
Right. Yeah, that one I find a little more morally tricky than the revolution.
Right. But occasionally you hear these things, Texas would like to secede from the Union, or California, Oregon, and Washington would be a block. Is this even constitutionally allowed? I mean, could a state leave?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, but most would say no. That is exactly the opposite of the Constitution. It was. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting was a lot of the original, opposition to the Constitution was that people wanted to keep their states as their country. Like, before the Revolution, you thought of your state as your country. You were not an American. You were a New Yorker. You were a Rhode Islander. You were a Virginian. And the Revolution bonded people a little because you had soldiers all fighting on the same side. But still, most people, I would argue, in 1789, thought of themselves identified more by their state than by their country. And so this Constitution was really radical and pissed a lot of people off because it said, no, the country is, and originally the phrase was, we the people of Rhode Island, of Pennsylvania, and there was argument and it was stricken. So now it just says, we the people of the United States. And that was a big deal. That was a big deal because that said the U.S. is the supreme. That is your identity, not these states. The states are secondary.
Oh, interesting. I guess it'd be like today telling the French or Germans, you're no longer French and German. You are now part of the EU, and the EU is a country. No. They would not like that.
No, that is the exact metaphor that a lot of historians use. They say it was much more like the EU.
Interesting. Yeah, it wasn't until the Gettysburg Address that people started referring to it instead of these United States,
right?
The United States.
Yeah, no, that is a very interesting change, and I read that. I read a book on that, and that Lincoln purposely did that. He was great, so it could well be, but that was a big change. And we have seen the states lose power over the centuries, that they were more powerful. They're gaining some of it back with the abortion and the Dobbs ruling, but still overall the states have lost power. And I'm personally, I'm okay with that, but obviously there are others who disagree.
All right, AJ, what are you going to spend a year doing next?
Well, my wife told me I had to take a break because she had enough,
Julie.
Quartering soldiers and wearing a bonnet.
You were a pirate. That's right. You wanted to be a pirate.
Being a pirate. So she had some issues. I do have another a project where I'm obsessed with puzzles, and I have a podcast called The Puzzler where I give word puzzles to our guests. And that is, so that does, and it's a daily show, so that does take some time.
Wow.
So,
like what kind of puzzles? I'm not sure I know what you mean.
Well, they're sort of like, here, let me give you an example. It's a very short podcast. It's just like 10 minutes. So it's almost like Wordle, but for listening. So,
okay.
I'm writing one now. I'm trying to think of an example. Oh, well, here's one. It would be sort of an audio puzzle where if I said the word tide, then that's a clue for rising tide. So, and if I said bananas, that's banana split. So that's
I see. Okay, gotcha. Oh, that's fun. All right.
I like
Sounds
doing
good. Well, I love your writing, love your work. Really super interesting. We'll have to have you on again just to talk about the Bible stuff, because that's also pretty interesting.
I would love to.
I mean, Old Testament morality. Holy moly.
Well,
you had a story in there about stoning somebody. You took like a little tiny pebble and threw
Yes, exactly. I took it. It says in the Hebrew scriptures to stone adulterers, and I needed to check that off. But I did, as you say, use pebbles because I didn't want to go to jail forever.
That's right.
But yeah. No, people talk about biblical morality, and, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Yes.
That's family values in the Bible. And
Yes.
he couldn't even be satisfied with 700 wives. He had to have 300 on the side. That is very bizarre to me.
He's going for Wilt Chamberlain's record.
Exactly.
Oh my God, it's insane. Yeah. All right, good place to stop. Thanks, AJ.
Thank you, Michael. It was a delight.